Okay, so we would like to hear from you. Questions, comments? Anyone else can share their experience with us? While folks are... Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Chastity Singleton. I'm in Nashville and I'm at an academic institution, but in this multi-specialty group, there are a lot of patients, I'm comprehensive, and there are a lot of patients that come to me for cataract surgery, for example, that have multiple ocular comorbidities. And I'm wondering how the IRIS registry, for example, the data that was shown for vision better than 20/40 after cataract surgery, but they have severe glaucoma or they have some retina problem that limits that ability to get to that level. Is there some way to designate through IRIS for those type of conditions? And also for the return to surgery, maybe there's either a plan to return to surgery by another specialist in the group, or after retina or glaucoma surgery, they develop a severe cataract that needs to be done within 90 days post-operative. Just how does the system delineate?
So the short answer is yes, you will be able to do that, and you'll actually be able to go back and look at the reasons. Hopefully you're just going to have a handful of patients that had to go back to the OR. And you'll be able to specifically pull up that patient, that individual patient, just the way Tim was showing you. So you'll identify your criteria, you'll put that in, it'll give you a list of those 5 patients that had a problem over the last year, and you'll be able to drill down into their medical record and find out exactly what happened to each of those.
So as it reports quality, does that suggest that our quality is less for those indicators?
So that's really a measure question. And so the Academy has been working with a variety of agencies, including CMS, to come up with appropriate quality measurements. If the numbers are big enough, issues, we all sort of think that we're seeing the sickest patients, and many of us are seeing very sick patients. If the numbers get big enough, then we're going to be able to say across a large population what the percentage of patients, regardless of their underlying disease processes, should end up at 20/40 or better. But again, they're benchmarks, they're not absolutes. And I think we're all going to be learning as we go forward how to evaluate this data.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a comment on that?
Hi, Suzanne Everhart. Much like Aaron, I have the same system, all Scribes and medflow, and I was interested in the technology and what's available now in terms of interfacing. What work has to go forth for the new measures to map medflow to IRIS registry? Is that something that's interfaced with medflow?
Well, I will ask the gentleman who built the system. Senkat, would you like to take that one?
He's gonna let me do that one here.
Alrighty.
So the good news is we've already worked with both of those systems, and so we already have that process worked out. There are no real interfaces that are required. We just need read-only access to the database, and that's something that we discuss with your IT staff or your vendor, whomever's involved at that level for your particular practice. As far as the mapping goes, a part of the implementation process for the IRIS registry is that your site is assigned a client account manager from our company that works directly with whomever you designate in your group. And they work with you to understand where the providers are documenting this information in the system. And the nice thing is that we take into account how each provider is documenting. We are collecting structured as well as unstructured data. So even if it's in a physician note, for example, as long as we know that information's there and we work through that, then we can map to that and pick that up. And so we take the unique documentation styles of each provider into account so that you don't all have to be using a standard documentation method. Does that help answer?
That's helpful. And also, in follow-up, how do I actually see how I'm doing?
Well, through the dashboard, in the beginning, you'll be, either you or again, whoever you designate, you'll be receiving some reports to see how you're performing. And in the beginning, you'll notice many of the trends that we showed, the trend graphs, they had an upward slope to them. And that's because as we work with your practice to understand and find the data, that your performance continues to increase. Once you meet, or you're in what we call maintenance or production, you'll have access to this dashboard. So every one of the participating providers within your group have access to this registry dashboard we've been showing you, as well as your administrative staff. Some groups, the docs like to look at this. Some, they just leave it to their administrators to view this and let them know how they're performing. But each one has that ability to see the breakdown of each measure and how you're performing and which patients are and are not meeting that particular measure.
And final question, right now I look at meaningful use, and medflow reports my meaningful use requirements because that's what we're doing now. As we move to MIPS, is your map in IRIS Registry going to provide all of that information to see that we're meeting those standards? So according to our lecture yesterday, I think we are out a little bit on the ACOs and the APMs, but otherwise it should be able to do it all?
Yes, that's correct. The registry currently can perform either for PQS reporting or also what's known as QCDR, as a qualified clinical data registry to CMS. But as CMS evolves into whatever program, we know MIPS is coming down the road, and whatever programs, the goal is to have the registries adapt and morph to be able to continue to report to whatever the requirements are for CMS.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Questions specifically about medflow. We're currently in the process of doing that mapping that you talked about, and as you know, as you come along a little bit later, that work will have been done by more and more people, and so there'll be less and less for you to do with your specific vendor as time goes by.
And just this week, David Park, Bill Rich, and Cherie McNett met with senior CMS officials, demonstrating to them the power of IRIS. And I think it's safe to say that they were impressed, and they see the potential here. As we discussed yesterday, theoretically, IRIS can give them everything they want to be able to track performance and improve value. I think George is first.
Yes, thank you, George. George Ellis from New Orleans. I have a comment and then a question. My comment is when Bill Rich introduced the IRIS registry to us several years ago, I could not get my head around what this was all about, and now I can see what a visionary he was, and I really appreciate all the work and effort that he put in and the Academy supported in this endeavor. It's been really going to be really helpful for a lot of us. Secondly, my question, Bob Wiggins just now and Michael Chang earlier today talked about some data. Michael's was a time motion study, and I've just heard some reports from the literature, and I'm having a little hard time trying to put all these little pieces together. I think, Bob, you said it was 15 hours a week of physician time for reporting these quality measures, and I heard Michael say that on his time motion study that physicians were spending 10 minutes with a patient, but also on the EMR part of it, it was the EMR documentation was taking 10 minutes a patient. And then I heard there was $40,000 a year per physician that was being spent on documentation, and I wasn't sure if that's physician time and how that relates to the 15 hours a week. And so is there some way to pull all this information into one easy to understand paragraph?
Yeah, most of that time in that slide is staff time entering the data, and a smaller portion is physician time, and likewise going along with the costs. So IRIS doesn't solve everything that we're doing, but I think I showed you it solves a big part of what we're doing, and I think, it's just going to be step by step. This is a quantum leap forward, though, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of improving workflow.
So if I understand, the 15 hours a week was mostly staff time?
It was mostly staff time.
And that's where the $40K a year came from?
Yes,
I see.
and a smaller portion was physician time.
Was physician time. And then, so Michael, I know you're in the audience. Can you justify those two times that you mentioned? One was the 10 minutes per patient that was taken up in documentation and 10 minutes per patient that was taken up in examination room time?
No, George, thanks for citing that. So let me just sort of describe where these data came from and what they do and don't say. So this part one is 5 ophthalmologists, all at OHSU, Oregon Health and Science University Academic Medical Center. We built some iPad apps and then followed these people around for about a year and a half. When the attending physician was in the room with the patient. So are they documenting, are they examining the patient, or are they talking to the patient? 10 minutes per patient, interaction time between the ophthalmologist and the patient, so 400 patient exams. Of that time, 30% was documenting in the EHR. Okay, that's part one. Part two is how much time total are these attending physicians documenting? So not residents, not fellows, not staff attendings. So we basically went back in the EHR audit log for every single doc at the medical center and figured out, when are they pointing and clicking? Like these EHRs document, they track every single mouse click and keystroke in an audit log. So for every patient, the attending physician is documenting 10 minutes is what we're seeing. And of that 10 minutes, some part occurs when they're in the room with the patient, some part occurs later in the day, some part occurs when they're at night. So that's where those figures
3
come
to
from.
4 minutes during the patient encounter, and then the additional 5 to 6, 7 minutes at another time.
Right.
Part, George, depends on, is the physician doing most of the data entry, or do you have a scribe doing the data entry? We use scribes in our practice, so when I was showing those 9 clicks, that was a scribe going through, and that was staff time there.
And I know that in some institutions, like at Oregon, there's residents and fellows that are entering as well. So it's a big hodgepodge, but it's a lot of good parameters that are helping us to try and understand this and the burnout question. So thank you.
Remember, when Iris is working, it's doing it when you're asleep. So it really is a very efficient way to gather this data. So Michael, you're building these apps yourself? Because I built some apps. Last one was for a credit card, but so it gives you a little feeling. We're all coming at this from a different perspective. Many of us are very IT savvy, many of us are not. And so the key to this technology, it's got to be seamless for us. And frankly, we're not there. There are still a few glitches. There are issues related to mapping. Some vendors are not as cooperative, I guess is probably the best word, as other vendors. But as you go forward and you start to consider information technology for your practices, this should probably be the second question you ask about any technology you're considering to acquire. The first will be the price. The second is, are you compatible with QCDRs? Front microphone.
Yeah, 2 questions. One, just following up to your comment. What is the most recent update on Epic connectivity?
Well, we have the most recent update. Sankat, would you like to share what we talked about?
Sure. So I'm going to try to be as appropriate as possible in this update. So we are pursuing, with most vendors, we pursue a pathway of upfront engagement and giving them the opportunity to be, to be a partner in the conversation while actually doing what we need to do and get the data out without them. The recent update with Epic is not a whole lot has changed in that we continue to have the ability to extract data from Epic without Epic, and we continue to have conversations with them to engage them, and that has been that way for years now. So that's basically what the update is. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you anything more encouraging.
Thank you. And then second question, there's a lot of concern among training centers that there's the potential for disincentivizing teachers of cataract surgery and other surgeries, given that complication rates will be accounted for. So what is the plan moving forward for teaching and training centers in this reporting?
Well, as someone who runs a residency and a fellowship, that's always a concern. I think that what we have to do to address the EPIC issue, and I'm at an EPIC-based institution, is we have to remember that we are the customer and that EPIC works for us. And the problem we have is that ophthalmology is a relatively small player in most major medical centers. But I've certainly spoken with our IT people, with my bosses, about the importance of them of EPIC being able to participate in this. And I'm going to dump it back to Senkat briefly. So you just told me that how many hundreds of thousands of potential doctors are now potentially enrolled in FIG-MD programs?
So if we count, okay, so here's how I would answer that question. So when we contracted with the AAO, that essentially opened up the possibility for the AAO membership to come on board. And I think you mentioned the number around there's about 18,000, correct? So if we take all of the contracted FIG-MD customers, at this point we're upwards of about 200,000 in terms of the potential. That's not 200,000 physicians on these registries, but that's the upper sort of potential as these registry programs escalate and become more robust. So
and how many did you have 2 years ago?
Pardon?
And what was that number 2 years ago?
It wasn't that. it was a lot lower than that. Yeah.
So I guess that my point is that the growth is astounding. And Epic or Cerner or the other big players are not going to be able to ignore this phenomenon. But we have to remember that we're the customers. And this is something that we need. It's good for patient care, it's good for physicians, and we simply can't take no for an answer any longer. Back microphone.
Yes, I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on successful communication about the dashboard in your practices, how it is that you're distributing dashboard information. Are you having each physician get a sign-on? We've done that. We've had some difficulties communicating about the dashboard because it's difficult to print the report. And I'm just interested also in whether or not you think it's leading to an evolution in your group of a physician quality leader, and whether or not you think that you have someone in your group that's taking that role on more because now we have data to look at.
Well, I'll share our experience. The first experience, whenever you're red or yellow, is the data's wrong. And certainly my data is consistent with the fact that I'm not performing where I need to. The data are what they are, but remember the data are not infallible. So you want to make sure that the data are accurate. So for example, in our practice, we were underperforming on something that we all knew we were doing. And it turned out that it was a mapping issue with our vendor identifying whether or not a letter was sent to the referring doctor. And once we were able to, again, working with FIG, to figure out what the issue was, then all of a sudden, we didn't change anything, but all of a sudden our numbers got better. So if the data doesn't make sense, don't just accept it on face value. If it doesn't make sense, question it. Try and find out why. We actually did an independent audit. We went through some of our charts just by hand, and we said, well, wait a minute, there it is. I said I sent the letter, and yet the mapping wasn't identifying that. But everyone, when they get a bad score, the immediate response is, well, something's wrong. Sometimes it is, but most of the time the data is accurate. And you have to look at that as the opportunity to get better. But I guess to directly answer your question, some of our guys are interested, some of them aren't. It's usually, if you're young, you want to go in and play around with it. If you're old, you don't play around with it. Bob, how's it working in your
I was
practice?
just going to say it's a good question, and currently what we're doing is reporting group metrics. Our board meetings are currently mostly all financial data, and this is going to change. We're going to be reporting that quality data as a part of our regular board reports. Currently what we're doing is going to those physicians and their clinics where they're not meeting the metrics to see what needs to be done to improve on those. But this is all going to change.
Is that George back there?
Ken.
Oh,
Ken.
Ken, I'm sorry.
Ken Chang. So this question was asked years ago when the whole EHR phenomenon started building, and I guess I'm kind of dense, and I'll ask it again, but especially now, since Iris is picking up all of this information in an incredibly valuable manner from the back end of the engine, it would seem to make sense, and it would seem that you would get better data and a better research tool if, just like a clinical trial, the front end was the same from everybody. And is there any thought of building the front end of the engine so there isn't errors in mapping and interpretation of the data as you pick it off, and one person's interpretation of something? In other words, if everybody had the same type of EMR going into this would solve so many problems with connection between different offices, and it would solve a giant headache. That seems to be the elephant in the room.
I'm going to ask Dr. Rich to answer that question.
Look, that would be the ideal world, and Mike Boland's up at the mic, and everyone wants to have a common data set. The big problem is getting the EHRs to adopt that data set, even if there was an easy way of sharing across platforms. We think that that's not going to happen on the regulatory side. That's going to happen on the client demand side. As we're starting to find out, Flora alum is in the back of the room. As people are starting to look at new systems, many practices, including mine, my partners here are listening to this, there's a secondary market now. So what we're doing is presenting our common data sets and said, will you adopt us in the EHR? They look at the market. This is an emerging market. I said, yeah. So the demand is going to come from the users, and I'm not very optimistic about the regulatory side. I'll make a brief comment about the big boys, Cerner and Epic. It's been frustrating working with Epic. There are no technology problems with this. However, I think we have a breakthrough, and in two places. Number one, the awarding of the Department of Defense contract to Cerner. The Department of Defense has a new subsidiary with an acronym that must have been done by the CIA. You can't figure out what it is. But their whole purpose is to develop comparative outcomes between all of their physicians in the Department of Defense system and their beneficiaries, so they can compare and show Congress and the different branches of the service we're providing quality care. They basically told Cerner, this is going to happen with Iris and others. The second thing that's going to change a little bit is if there's a different demand on Epic centers for reporting of specialists. And pretty sure that's going to happen. We've had extensive discussions. This is being driven by the consumers, not us. Once that happens, and specialists, or academic centers, large groups of any kind, have to start reporting, they're going to be putting the pressure on Epic, which will be much more effective than the regulatory process through ONC. So I'm optimistic long-term about both Cerner first and then Epic.
And Congress is starting to listen. Now remember, we have the, what's the name of the act, Kathy? Yeah, basically the Interoperability Act. Congress has spent a lot of money to get us all to where we are. And when you explain that certain vendors are not playing ball with everybody, they're not happy. So one way or another, whether through the free market or through the legislature, I think it's going to get fixed. Yes?
Great. So I just wanted to address what I think is the ongoing sort of misunderstanding about Epic. There's been this problem, I think, since the beginning. First of all, we've had a method now for months of extracting data from Epic in a standardized way and shipping it to Fix. If you guys aren't aware of that, we need to chat. And second of all, I think as you're thinking about this, you got to think about, Epic doesn't control my data at Johns Hopkins, right? I control my data. So you're going to have to interact with the actual source of the data, which is all these academic medical centers. Not that that's any better than interacting with a large company, but all the data are controlled at the local place, not centrally. So if you're going to Epic to get data out of my institution, you're going to the wrong wrong place. So I'm happy to talk with anybody about any of those pieces, but I'm surprised you're still claiming it's a problem because it has not been now for months. There's a published method, we've been sharing it. Josh is working on it at Michigan, they're working on it at Pittsburgh, other places for getting this stuff out. And you guys should be getting data already from some institutions. So that's a weird statement that I'm happy to talk to anybody about.
No, so we are getting data from Epic
No,
centers.
no. So again, right, from Epic sites, yes. Every site has the ability, whether it's a priority or not, and maybe it goes back to what Bill said, there's no real, we don't need the quality piece, right, in most of the large places. So whether it gets prioritized at the local place to turn on, separate question, right? But that's the fundamental issue. And then real quick on the interoperability piece, even if Congress does put something out, we need to be thinking as a specialty about how we are going to share our data, because you're going to get a standard that works great for internal medicine. We'll have blood pressure, height, and weight. But if we want our stuff to be transmittable and shared with each other, we're going to have to do work as an organization to make that happen, as a second comment. But I'm happy to talk to Fig again about Epic, because I think there's still a misunderstanding that I'm happy to help address.
You might want to read your Epic contract, a little more detail.
No, so there's nothing in there that I can't share data with anybody I want to.
You might want to read it again.
I swear to God, it works fine.
Dr. Park.
Yeah, one thing I'd just like to mention is we've been talking about ophthalmology and iris. And one of the things that is going to give us all power going forward is the fact that we are by no means alone anymore in these issues. When we started, we tried to learn from cardiology, who was really the first specialty out there with an outpatient-based data integrator technology using FIG. And, you know, they were how many years ahead of us in terms of time, Sanket? 3 years? 4 years? 4 years. They were 4 years ahead of us. We now have 4 times the database that they do. So that's all thanks to basically all of you who really have demonstrated a real interest in being able to know what you're doing and move the quality needle. But we were the early adopters. We now have neurology, dermatology, urology, rheumatology, family medicine, psychiatry is getting into it, ENT, who else am I missing?
Oncology?
Oncology. Emergency physicians.
Emergency medicine. So the point is that when the issues that we were going to Congress with, that we were going to the agencies with as ophthalmology, we're really going to now as a huge portion of medicine. So our ability to leverage this is really increasing, and our ability, we're finding now when we talk to the various EHR vendors, I'm not talking Epic or Cerner here, I'm talking about the next gens and the next techs and the CompuLinks of the world, is 2 years ago we were kind of blown off by them because we were not on their radar screen. They now recognize that it really is in their best interest to have something that works seamlessly with Iris because, quite frankly, they can market their product better. It's all dollars and cents. And so we are leveraged now to have better input into data fields, our ability now to talk to companies like Zeiss about actually direct input of some of the data that is supposed to be DICOM compatible, like OCT data, visual field data, et cetera, is now increased. So the external game is changing as well as what's happening internally.
So I think that's a good segue to perhaps our closing comments. And that's that this is the first iPhone. There's going to be a lot of development. And Sanket, I'm wondering if you could share with us sort of your vision of where you see this going. Where we had a nice review of where we are today. Where are we going to be in 5 years with this technology?
So I think what we've been able to accomplish, with a lot of support from the AAO and the other specialties at the table, is really demonstrate that data liquidity at a national scale is possible, and that continues to impress various parties that are looking at this, including CMS and ONCs. So so we've been able to demonstrate that what we have to do in the near term and sort of the midterm is to scale and move that number closer to the 200,000 plus on the same platform. I think having this amount of data in a fundamental way that's interoperable also presents a lot of opportunities for collaboration between different specialties in a way that, quite frankly, was never possible before. So there's certainly collaborative opportunities that could, I'm confident will lead to even better opportunities to improve care. When we started doing this, the entire act of data extraction and reporting on it was, again, quarterly. We've taken it down to, reporting monthly. We're doing data extracts nightly, from many participants. I think what this will allow us to do is take the discipline of quality measurement and, going back to your the cereal box analogy. Hopefully, within the next 5 years, we won't be throwing that slide up and pointing to the deficits in transparency as far as what is happening in healthcare. And initiatives like IRIS are, I think, going to be very, very critical. And it's sort of interesting thought. The more we do this, we're actually getting inbounds from HIEs and who are asking that, hey, since you have the data from the physicians, can you send it to the HIE? That's not supposed to be a function of the registry. But what the registries have in effect done have solved the last mile problem, which even the HIEs and the models that have been prescribed by the feds aren't able to solve in an effective manner. So the more we do this, the more the dimension, the less this will be called a registry, and the more it will be called a data liquidity platform, analytics platform, what have you. And I think that's where this is headed. We want to be in a position where, when you say registries, there's a very set way of thinking about that concept, and I don't think IRIS is a registry. It's a whole lot more than that, and I think we'll be achieving that pivot very soon here.
So to speak to that point, for those of you who had the opportunity to attend Mike Repka's session earlier this morning on public reporting, we heard that from the two consumer advocates. We heard it from the gentleman from Consumer Reports, and we heard it from the U.S. News World Report editor. They want this data. And multiple times the concept of transparency was brought up. The public is demanding this information about their health care. And it's a bit early, but the example that has been given is the Society for Thoracic Surgeons, where you can go now and you can look up and see what their success rate is for a variety of major heart and thoracic procedures. And that's the type of transparency it's simply going to be demanded. Earlier I said that we're the customer for the EHR companies. Well, the patients are our customers, and they're going to demand this information. And now we're going to be in a position to be able to give it to them. And at the end of the day, I think that's going to be a great thing for everybody. Any other questions or comments? Paul.
So we have all this information, and it's granular down to the physician detail, patient detail. Is any of this information subject to subpoena in a malpractice case or any sort of situation like that?
So there's two, obviously the patient medical record is always subject. So are you looking at the quality issues? So in other words, your performance.
Right, exactly. So if you have a physician whose performance may be below the average, and would that be something that could be introduced into court?
So as of today, no. The MACRA statute specifically prevents this type of peer review data. The same concept of the peer review process. That is still not accessible for civil litigation. And I forget what clause it is, but it's in the MACRA Act that it cannot be used. Obviously, could that change? Could a clever lawyer get a federal judge to rule to release that? Sure. But as of today, no. Dr. Park, do you have any closing comments? No. Then I think we are adjourned. Thank you all.